It's a very interesting thing to explore. We do have the debate in Australia. We don't have a Bill of Rights. So there's often an accusation pointed at what might be called activist judges, that they are trying to de facto build a Bill of Rights. In America, as you've said, there's always tremendous tension around the issue of who goes onto the Supreme Court. Are they people who will be activists, as they're known, or will they be people who respect the political process? And there's a couple of major issues coming up there now. And no matter what they decide, there'll be a lot of unhappiness, I suspect. Do you think there's a problem of the degrading of the law in the standing of the people's eyes if they become too activist, because they're not elected, you see, and they can't be removed by the people?
Well, that has, on the whole, not happened in the United States, where whatever people may think of individual justices, there is a considerable body across the political spectrum of respect for the institution of the Supreme Court as such. But I wonder how long that can last. The problem about many of the decisions of the US Supreme Court is that it has taken out of the hands of citizens decisions on intensely important moral issues in particular, like abortion, same-sex relationships, and so on. I personally agree with most of the decisions that the critics of the Supreme Court dislike. I'm in favour of a carefully regulated right of abortion. I have no problem about same-sex relationships or marriages. But I do think that the way in which these things have been introduced into the polity of the United States was a serious mistake, because I think that the legislative process can have an important influence in reconciling people to radical changes in social values. If it's imposed on them by a judicial body, I don't think that the process is anything like as smooth. It's very striking that abortion is virtually a non-issue in Europe. And that is because every country in Europe, pretty well without exception, has adopted a regulated right of abortion. I think Malta is now the only exception. And they've always adopted it by legislation. This country, the United Kingdom, was the very first to do so in the 1960s. And I think that the fact that this was the subject of serious debate and of legislative resolution is a major reason why this is no longer an issue, even among those who would like to see abortion more tightly regulated or even outlawed. It's gone away, whereas it is an electric issue in the United States. Increasingly, elections in the United States have become contests for the right to appoint members of the Supreme Court. That seems to me to be a profoundly unhealthy state of affairs.
Here in Britain, I think the great surprise of the decision at a referendum to separate Britain out from Europe again had implications as well for the judiciary and the law in the country. Would you make any comments about how that unfolded?
Well, there were two major decisions of the Supreme Court in which the method which the government had adopted of pulling out of the EU was declared to be unlawful. They were both decisions arising out of applications by Gina Miller, who was an active pro-European campaigner. I was party to the first of those decisions, which decided that the government could not serve notice on the EU to withdraw without parliamentary authority. I was not party to the second because I had by then retired, but I have publicly defended the second decision, so it follows that I support both of them. They both have a common factor which tends to get overlooked. They are both defenders, they're both decisions which defended the powers of Parliament against an overbearing executive. That was particularly true of the second, which declared illegal the government's attempt to prorogue Parliament in order to silence it in the build-up to the late stages of the negotiations with the EU. What the government wanted to do was to put Parliament into abeyance for a period of a particularly vital period of some 5 or 6 weeks. And they were prevented from doing that. And it seems to me that the reason why they were prevented, which is not quite the way that it was expressed by the judgments, but it's the way that I would express it. If the government had been right about this, the public power to prorogue Parliament would have been converted into a private privilege of the Prime Minister, because it would have been beyond challenge. There would have been no Parliament, so it couldn't be challenged in Parliament. It couldn't be challenged by the public because they have no institutional means of challenging government policy politically other than through Parliament. It couldn't have been challenged in the court because if it had won its right to prorogue, Parliament would have been declared lawful. So you would have had a complete void at the heart of government in which the government was, in the most technical sense of the term, completely irresponsible. That is to say, there was no way in which it could be held responsible for the decisions that it made. It is fundamental to our constitution and part of the reason why we limit the political role of the court, that politicians and government ministers are politically answerable. This would have made them politically answerable to nobody. So I was in favour, after a certain amount of hesitation at the outset, I was in favour of the decision which the Supreme Court arrived at. I think it's wrong to regard this as an example of judicial activism. When we talk of judicial activism, what we normally mean is an intrusion by the courts into the policy-making functions of the executive. This was an attempt by the courts to prevent ministers from intruding into the proper legislative and political functions of the legislature. And since the legislature and its complete power is absolutely at the heart of the British Constitution, that was a development of great importance.
Understood. There's a traditional view, and it's certainly alive in Australia as well, or sentiment to the effect that the more laws a country has, the worse or more vicious its inhabitants must be. And I think you pointed out the English statute books now fill up about 50 thick volumes. And say in relation to tax law in Australia, as people have found more and more ways to evade their responsibilities, the tax law in Australia now is just incomprehensibly dense.
It's not much better here.
And voluminous. I mean, it is just unbelievable. And we seem to be creating new laws at the drop of a hat now at a faster rate. I don't know how anyone in the judiciary ever keeps track of everything that's happening, let alone the citizen in the street. And you've also talked about this sort of social absolutism that we now see emerging, increasing intolerance of living with risks that we once would have thought normal. What do you think about, and what drives this explosion of resort to legal remedy and more laws? Or more, not so much legal remedy, but more and more laws.
The main reason is the development of democratic institutions since the end of the 19th century, certainly in this country and I think in many other countries as well. As political power becomes more democratic, people develop higher expectations of what political action can do, and law is the instrument by which political action can be imposed on the population at large. I don't object to all of this. I think that it has gone too far, and in particular, I think that what started as a quest for basic security and therefore a high degree of regulation of bodies whose decisions can radically affect people's lives, that is how it started. There is an economic argument for and against high degree of regulation, but there's no doubt that that's what the public expects, and therefore in a democracy it's what we must expect. What I think is particularly unfortunate is the tendency of people to use law as a means of imposing their own moral values on others who don't share those values. There are some things, thou shalt not kill, which can be regarded as universal values. There is a high degree of consensus that they ought to be forbidden, and there is no way of forbidding them effectively otherwise than by law. But that does not apply to things like animal rights legislation, just to take one random example. There are laws in this country against wearing, not against wearing mink, but against farming mink. There are demands for laws against wearing it. Now, there are also demands for laws. California actually had such a law for a short time until it was quashed, against eating things like foie gras, which are thought to be cruel. Now, whenever one might think about this, it's a point on which people disagree. In many countries, eating foie gras is fine. In this country, it's fine for quite a lot of people. They do not feel a moral imperative to suppress the French foie gras industry or to suppress the British mink farming industry. Now, that seems to me to be a classic kind of issue on which people are entitled to make their own mind up and to act in accordance with their own moral views. I find the desire to use law as a tool for imposing conformity extremely dangerous. It can be carried into fields a great deal more significant than animal rights legislation, and I would be dismayed if it ever were.